The world in this story resembles the Russian push into Siberia from the late 1600s through the 1800s, when the empire's reach moved eastward along river corridors and forest routes, following land, and strategic control. What outsiders often imagine as a single frontier was, in reality, a patchwork of tiny settlements separated by vast distances, some little more than a dozen log houses clustered nearest, and of timber and a reliable water source. In winter, those clusters became islands surrounded by lethal weather. Why people went north and east? Many settlers were not adventurers in the romantic sense. They were families and laborers drawn by a brutally practical promised land, autonomy, and a chance to own something. In the older, more governed regions to the west and south, land was controlled and opportunity was narrow. On the edge, a person with strong hands and little property could at least in theory build a house, clear ground, raise livestock, and become someone with a stake in the world. That hope pulled people into environments where the price of a mistake was death. The settlement economy and the tyranny of fuel in subarctic and continental interiors went to living as an energy equation. Heat is life, and heat means fuel. For most households, that fuel was woodcut, hollowed, wet, stacked, protected from snow, rationed, and then consumed faster than any newcomer expected. On calm days, the routine was punishing. On storm days, became a trap. You needed more fire to survive, but the storm made it harder and more dangerous to get wood. This is why older frontiers develop a kind of grim wisdom. Winter is not one problem, a chain of problems that amplify each other. Log houses and why wind is the real enemy. A typical frontier log house comparable in spirit to the Russianized EBA could be built quickly using local timber, but quickly came at a cost. Logs were rarely straight. Joinery varied by skill and available tools. Between logs were gaps small at first, then larger as the wood shrank, swelled, froze, and shifted. The wind did not need a wide opening. It needed one weak point. Then it turned the house into an instrument whistling through cracks, pushing smoke back down chimneys, lifting roof edges, driving snow into seams. The wind was not just cold air, it was pressure, testing the building like a living thing trying to pry its way in. A world of improvised insulation. Before industrial insulation, people used what they had: moss, clay, straw, animal hides, felted wool, rugs, internal hangings, and crucially space management. They would subdivide a room with blankets to create smaller heated zones, or would hang hides to trap still air. They would banks, no against walls, counterintuitively useful because snow holds air and can insulate. Maintenance was not seasonal, it was daily. Patch, fail, patch again because the structure never stopped moving. Roof and chimney, the two constant anxieties. Roofs carried snow load. Even a well-built roof could groan under drifting snow on the leeward side. Clearing snow was dangerous. Slick surfaces, hands, and wind trying to throw a person off balance. Chimneys were another frontier paradox. A straight vertical chimney drafts well, but wind over the top can create down-draft and smoke blowback. This is why some builders experimented with intentional bends or curves trying to disrupt the wind's ability to force air back into the flue. Those solutions demanded higher skill. So when archaeologists find them in remote places, it raises the same question your story explores: how did this knowledge spread? Traveling craftsmen, local experimentation, or borrowed techniques, indigenous knowledge and cultural blending. Siberia was never an empty stage. People such as the Ivanki, Yakutsaka, and others had lived with this climate for countless generations, developing sophisticated ways to read wind, terrain, snow drift patterns, animal behavior, and pressure changes. Their shelters were often designed to be wind-smart entrances, oriented away from prevailing winds. Camps placed behind natural breaks, and routines tuned to weather signals outsiders missed. As Russian settlers arrived, knowledge flowed both ways, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, sometimes mixed with religious practice. It was common for frontier communities to become culturally layered official orthodoxy on the surface, practical folk practices underneath, and a shared understanding that in lethal climates whatever works becomes sacred. Why the archaeology becomes mysterious. Frontier people rarely wrote technical manuals. Many techniques were transmitted by watching, copying, and adjusting. Centuries later, the archaeologists find grooved interior log surfaces, unusual drainage minus like trenches, odd chimney geometry, caches of objects under threshold, evidence of function, but not intention. Some features may be acoustic tricks, some insulation channels, some drainage, some pest control, some ritual boundaries, and some may have served multiple meanings at once. Your story's core insight matches what careful historians often conclude: the past is not a puzzle with one clean solution. It is a landscape of partial truths, where honesty requires saying, "We can infer, but we cannot fully know." English translation expanded. Faithful and readable. The hearth is your lifeline, yet it devours firewood at an astonishing speed. Every log must be felled, dragged home, split, stacked. The labor eats the daylight. The wind makes everything worse when you saw. It throws dust and sawdust into your eyes when you carry split wood. It leans into you like a stubborn animal. On the worst days when the wind howls without pause, keeping warm for one day can cost the work of 3. Then morning light filters through the small window, an opening stretched with scraped hide that glows amber when the sun hits it. You prepare a simple meal. Water must be melted from snow, and that takes time and fuel. Porridge thickens slowly over the fire as you stir. You eat standing close to the hearth, because the far corners of the room are still knife minus gold. The family gathers in, children wrapped in blankets, everyone shifting by inches, trying to catch whatever heat the stones will surrender. The wind keeps singing its endless song, the background to every conversation and every thought. All day, you repair. You grab dry moss by the handful and stuff it into the seams between the logs, using a wooden tool made for that one purpose to drive it in tight. The moss was gathered in autumn, when it still held moisture and flexibility. Now in winter, it has dried into a brittle thing. You dampen it with melted snow so it will work in your hands. Then press it deep into the cracks. Over that you smear a mixture of clay and straw, smoothing it with your fingers until the seam disappears. In this cold, the clay freezes almost instantly hard. Sharp, gradual. By tomorrow some of the same patches will fail again, cracked open by the way the logs expand and contract. This becomes your rhythm. Patch, fail, patch again. You hang hides over the weakest parts of the wall to form a second windbreak. When the gusts hit, the hides billow and twitch, but they trap a thin layer of still air and give you a little insulation. Blankets are hung from wooden pegs to create temporary inner walls, dividing the single room into smaller spaces. Those fabric walls pulse with the pressure shifts, breathing in undoubt as the wind changes. The children watch you work and learn by watching. They will need these skills. Anyone who survives the winter here becomes an expert at reading wind, understanding how structures fail, and knowing which repairs must come first. The door is a constant misery. You built it as well as you could, but wood is never perfectly straight. And as the ground beneath freezes and heaves, the frame settles unevenly. Gaps appear at the edges. When the wind hits the door head minus on, the latch fights to hold. You cram rags into the seams only to have them loosen on their own. You pile heavy objects at the threshold to keep it sealed, yet on the worst nights the door still chatters in its frame. And you lie awake, listening, wondering whether it will hold. The roof may be your greatest worry. It was built carefully, rafters joined with wooden joints, birch bark for waterproofing, thorn planks above that, then thick sod packed down on top. But the wind pushes from above and below, creating forces that wood does not always endure. Snow drifts on the leeward side, adding weight until the beams begin to complain, creaking, sagging. Speaking in that language of strain you have learned to fear, you climb up regularly to clear the heaviest buildup, using a long pole touche of snow off before it becomes too heavy. It is dangerous work on a slick surface while the wind tries to steal your balance. Each time you climb down safely, relieved angles with dread because you know you will have to do it again. The wind never stops, so your work never ends. Inside the cabin, the wind becomes intimate knowledge. You learn to distinguish different drafts by how they touch your skin. There is the sharp needle of air that comes straight through a wall seam, finding you wherever you sit. There is the rolling current along the floor, invisible but unmistakable as it passes over your feet. There is the falling draft from the roof space, chilled air sinking down when the fire burns low. Each requires a different response, a different priority, a different kind of patch. The wind sound becomes a vocabulary. A low moan, as specific seam means a north wind. A high whistle between roof boards means a west wind. The doors rattling means sustained pressure, not a brief gust. The roof beams groaning tells you about snow-loading structural stress. You learn to sleep through certain noises, but other sounds pull you awake instantly. A sudden crack, a new groan, a change in pitch that means something has shifted. Something has broken. At night you bank the fire carefully, feeding it with large logs so it will burn slow in the dark. You drag every blanket and hide close to the sleeping platform. Here, the warm nest inside the cold room. Family crowds together, charring body heat, children curled between adults. Even so, the cold finds you. Your exposed face goes numb. Your breath freezes on the blankets. You wake again and again to check the fire. Night wind sounds different, more sinister, as if darkness gives it extra strength. The cabin groans and moves, the logs speaking to one another in wooden phrases. Sometimes you hear something fall outside, a tool torn from its place, a section of fence collapsing, a pile of firewood scattering. Those sounds mean tomorrow's labor, more repairs added to the endless list. You lie in the dark and listen, trying to identify damage by sound alone. Experienced each as you, the difference, the dull thump of moss pulled loose from a seam, the clean snap of a frozen branch, breaking the persistent clatter that means a shutter has come loose. Dawn arrives late, and the darkness retreats unwillingly. You rise again, stiff from cold and shallow sleep, and begin the cycle once more. Outside, you survey what the night has changed. Perhaps the chimney cap has shifted and snow has fallen into the flue. Perhaps the woodpile has collapsed. Perhaps new cracks have appeared where I swedged into the log seams. You gather your tools, wooden wedges, leather straps, rope, a small hammer, a knife for trimming and shaping. The work is familiar, but never identical. Each day presents its own constellation of damage and necessary response. Your neighbors emerge from their cabins. You exchange shouted words across the wind. One needs help securing part of a roof. Another has lost a latch and is holding the door shut with rope. These are winter's small tragedies, and everyone understands help given now will be repaid when your own crisis comes. Community here is not about leisure or friendship. It is about survival. You work together because alone you die, and the wind makes that truth impossible to deny. The physical cost of fighting the wind accumulates slowly. Your hands grow rough and cracked, fingertips split by cold, dry air. Your shoulders ache from hauling materials and working against the wind. Your back burns from bending over snow. Clay. Sweet debt piles up when the cabin shudders and creaks around you. You never truly rest. Smoke stings your eyes. A wind minus driven grit scratches them. Your lungs hurt from breathing air so cold it feels sharp. The wind does not strike once and leave. It haunts you, day after day, wearing down strength and nerve. The children suffer too, in their own ways. During the worst storms they become quiet, huddling and whispering. They develop fear of certain sounds. One is terrified by the roof beams groan, another fears the moan of wind through a particular scene. They watch adult faces for signs, learning anxiety from a glance, from a quickened step. They ask questions that are hard to answer. Will the roof collapse? Will the wind ever stop? You give them tasks, fetching small things, helping pack moss, holding tools so they feel useful and stay occupied. though the fear beneath remains. The psychological weight of continuous wind is hard to describe to anyone who has not lived inside it. It is not merely noise. You can learn to ignore noise. It is the unendingness of it, the fact that the wind is always there, always testing, always pushing. You cannot fully relax, because you must stay alert. You cannot sleep deeply, because something may fail while you sleep. The wind becomes an opponent you can never defeat, only resist for a while. Over a long winter, a strange sensation grows, the feeling that the outside world is actively trying to get in. And the wind is not random but purposeful. The walls are the only line between inside and outside, between order and chaos, between life and death. When the wind is at its fiercest, those walls feel so fragile it is almost unbearable. You find yourself checking them compulsively, touching them, forcing yourself to believe they are solid. You develop small rituals and superstitions, behaviors that feel helpful even when you know, rationally, they do nothing. You patch certain seams in a specific order. You speak the same words each morning as you check the walls. You arrange your tools with exactness, as if order inside could influence chaos outside. The rituals offer comfort. They offer a sense of control, even when you know control is minimal. The wind will do what it does. You can only respond. The worst moments come during the fiercest storms, when the wind speed is enough to make the entire cabin tremble. Walls bow inward. The roof lifts and drops. The door twists in its frame. Then, you pull the family to the center of the room, away from the walls, and to the strongest part of the roof. You keep tools close, an axe, in case you must cut a way out if the roof collapses, blankets, in case you must run into the storm. You make plans, you pray. You will never use where you will flee, how you will signal neighbors, what you will grab in the few seconds you might have. These are survival calculations, grim, practical. Then the storm passes, or rather, it weakens to something you can endure. The wind drops from a scream to a groan. You step outside and assess the damage. What must be fixed now? What can wait? You see neighbors doing the same, and in the exchanged glance, there is unspoken understanding. You survived another assault. Tomorrow there will be another. This cycle continues for months, waking, patching, enduring, till sleep, waking again. The wind shapes everything: how you build, how you sleep, how you think about safety and shelter. It teaches you that strength is not enough. A structure that is too rigid fails. You must build with flexibility, allowing small movement rather than demanding absolute resistance. It teaches you perfection is impossible. Every repair is temporary. Every solution is partial. Your goal is not to eliminate problems, only to manage them well enough to live. It teaches humility. You are small, and nature's forces are vast. Your best efforts are only a small refusal against an indifferent universe. And still you persist, because what else can you do? You persist because spring will come, even when the deepest winter makes that feel impossible. You persist because others persist too, and their endurance proves survival is possible. You persist because you have no choice. So another morning comes. You feel the draft along the floor and reach for your tools again. The wind howls outside, cold and eternal. With stiff fingers you stuff moss into cracks, knowing it will loosen again. You bank the fire and hope the chimney draws cleanly through the night. You hold your children close and listen to the cabin groan around you. This is life in the killing wind, not one dramatic moment, but an endless accumulation of small battles, small victories, small failures. The wind is always there, always testing, and you are there too, stubbornly holding the line between inside and outside, warmth and cold, survival and surrender. And tomorrow you awake and begin again, because that is what survival winter wind demands: an endless, patient, quiet resolve to keep standing when everything tries to push you down. Turning to a specific life, Simon Gregorievich. Over time, the wind's ancient song pulls our attention toward one concrete life, someone so bound to winter wind that his story became part of the land's own memory. His name, according to scattered records and oral tradition, was Semyon Grigoryevich. He was not born into privilege. His earliest memories were of a northern frontier settlement, where his family came seeking land and chance. The settlement was new and fragile, cabins thrown up quickly, walls leaking wind, roofs bending under snow, chimneys drawing poorly. Semyon's childhood was shaped by cold and by the pressure of wind that never stopped testing every building. His father farmed when weather allowed and repaired damage in winter. His mother guarded the hearth and mended clothing worn thin by hardship. Semyon had siblings. They all slept on a single platform, staring body heat through long nights. Even by frontier standards, their cabin was crude. Wind found paths through seams that seemed to multiply every season. Their journey north had taken months by cart, then by river boat, everything they owned packed into a few wooden boxes and oilcloth bundles. Semyon remembered fragments, the smell of rivers, his mother holding the youngest child, the faces of other families moving toward an uncertain future. When they arrived, there were perhaps 15 cabins scattered between forest and water. Some families had already survived at least one winter and carried the exhausted expertise of people whose assumptions had been broken. Semyon's cabin went up in a day of collective labor, rough logs. Some still barked, fitted by hope more than precision. Moss and clay filled gaps too large to forgive. The roof was birch bark, planks, sod built for speed, not endurance. It leaked in the first rain. When winter came, the wind found every weakness. They spent the first months in constant battle with cold, and even their best ceiling could not fully stop it. His mother rose multiple times each night to feed the fire, because letting it die could mean the children would die. His father worked in darkness before dawn and after dusk, packing fresh moss into seams, nailing bark strips over the widest cracks, doing everything possible with limited time and limited materials. That first winter took lives in quiet ways. An infant who did not wake one morning, an old man found frozen near his own door. They were not dramatic deaths. They were surrendered to cold, and they taught the survivors that winter was not an adventure. It was an opponent that demanded continuous vigilance. Semyon was too young to grasp death fully. He understood the fear in adult eyes when storms approached. He understood the tension when firewood ran low. He understood that walls were not truly solid, only temporary barriers against forces that could kill as easily as blowing out a candle. His siblings adapted differently. An older brother hardened into practicality. Younger sisters grew into a quiet acceptance that hardship was simply what life was. But Semyon developed a different hunger, the need to understand how survival worked beneath routine, what principles separated a cabin that held from a cabin that failed. He noticed where frost formed thickest on interior walls. He noticed the wind hit hardest at the northwest corner, which needed constant repairs. He noticed snow drifts against the north wall, sometimes insulated as much as they threatened. Those observations had no immediate use for a child, but they were the beginning of an education that would define his life. When Semyon was about 7, the event came that set his course. It was late winter, that dangerous time when people begin to believe the worst is over, when supplies are low and attention can slip. The storm arrived with little warning. By evening, the wind rose into a sustained roar. The family did what they always did: bank the fire, seal the seams, prepare to endure. But this storm was different. It did not come in gusts. It pressed without pause. Semyon woke in darkness to the sound of wood cracking, not the usual groan, but a sharper, final sound. He heard his father shouting, his mother pulling children together, his sisters clinging to him. The roof collapse was a sound he never forgot, wood splitting everywhere at once, the main beam breaking, the structure folding inward with a terrifying crash. Cold air surged in like an avalanche, bringing snow with it, burying everything in choking white. Hands grabbed him, pulling him upward through wreckage and snow. His father's voice was there, but words vanished into the storm. His mother's face flashed in the dark, snow minus covered, his wide with a terror beyond ordinary fear. His brother cried or screamed, he could not tell. They made it outside into the full violence of the storm. The wind was so strong, standing was a fight. His father seized his arm and dragged him toward a neighbor's cabin. His mother carried one child. His brother carried the other. They staggered through darkness where snow flew sideways and lanterns were faint, moving dots. The neighbor's cabin took them in. They stayed packed together for days, too many bodies. Too little space. Comforts irrelevant. They shared warmth, food, and the work of keeping the fire alive, collecting fuel lonely during short lulls when stepping outside was survivable. When they returned to the wreck of their home, he found the roof collapsed inward, possessions buried and broken. The loom was crushed. Family's precious tools earned over years were damaged, lost, or vanished into snow. It was rare on the frontier. Homes were lost, rebuilt, lost again. But for Semyon, something deeper than fear took root. He had felt the moment shelter became danger. He became obsessed with how structures fail. He watched rebuilding and asked relentless questions. Why this joint? Not that. Why this roof angle? Why pack moss this way? At first adults answered out of patience, then with interest, because the boy wasn't merely copying, he was trying to grasp the underlying logic. He began listening to the wind differently. Other children heard only noise. Semyon heard pitch and direction and learned to link a sound to a leak. He could point there, and when adults checked, he was often right. It seemed like magic, but it was only careful attention. As he grew, he helped rebuild many cabins and learned from different methods. He noticed patterns. Certain roof angles shed snow better, certain siding choices reduced exposure, straighter logs sealed tighter, orientation mattered. Some of these were deliberate, others accidental. Semyon tried to separate useful technique from luck. By adulthood, he earned a reputation across settlements. People called him the wind-reader, sometimes respectfully, sometimes with a teasing edge, as if it were strange to spend so much thought on an invisible force. But when storms threatened, people came to him. He would walk a cabin's perimeter, sometimes closing his eyes to listen, sometimes pressing a hand to the wall to feel vibration. He identified weak points: a seam that would widen, a beam missing support, a roof section that would fail under heavy snow. His advice was practical: brace this corner, repack the north wall, till the windbreak 3 steps from the door. Those who listened suffered fewer crises. Those who ignored him often regretted it later. Preparing in desperation during the worst weather, at 20-3 he married Ekaterina, a strong, practical woman newly arrived with her family. She understood his focus was eccentricity, it was wisdom. They built their own cabin using everything he had learned at a sheltered site. Carefully chosen straight logs, a steeper roof, better ceiling, a recessed entry forming a small vestibule, and a chimney with a subtle curve, something he had once observed in an old trapper's hut meant to reduce wind-driven backdraft. When their first major storm hit, Ekaterina listened to wind batter other cabins while theirs held steadier, quieter. She understood she had married not just a man, but a philosophy, patient preparation. They had children, first a son, then a daughter, and with them came new fear. Semyon became even more meticulous. He built a small felt-walled sleeping enclosure near the stove to trap warmth and protect the baby from drafts without risking overheating or fire. He taught his son to read wind and prioritize repairs, threading lessons into daily work: how to test chin king with fingertips, how to read dampness at beam bottoms, how to decide what must be fixed now and what can wait. And he kept listening, even in summer, watching how wind moved through the settlement, how it shifted by season, how humidity and temperature changed, how sound carried. Knowledge accumulated like snowdrifts, small amounts becoming, over years, a formidable mass. Then came the winter, when Ekaterina fell ill, first a cough, then fever and weakness. With no doctor, only folk remedies and what care he could provide. Semyon fought to keep her warm, fed and breathing, and in that exhausted, frightened time, the settlement faced the storm later, called the Night of the Roaring North Wind. Storm built through the afternoon, giving time to prepare, but preparation could only go so far. By dusk it was deadly to be outside. Snow filled the air. The wind did not come in gusts, it pressed continuously, a physical force shoving every surface. Semyon's cabin held. But through the noise he heard the unmistakable sounds of other structures suffering, cracking timber, partial collapses, the chaos of failure. He stood by the window, thinking of neighbors, old couples, families with small children, people he knew had weak roofs or bad latches. He faced an impossible choice: stay with his sick wife and frightened children, or go into the storm to help others who might die without intervention. From her bedding, they rushed but lucid. Ekaterina looked at him and understood what he was calculating. She spoke one word, barely audible over the wind. Go. It held permission, understanding, acceptance of risk, and trust. Smian wrapped himself in every warm layer he owned, took rope and tools, little lantern, and stepped into the storm. The wind hit him like a blow. Snow flew horizontally, the stinging exposed skin, turning vision into white chaos. The lantern's flame bucked wildly but held. Visibility shrank to a dim circle of light beyond it. Darkness and wind erased the world. He navigated by memory and counting steps. He reached an elderly couple's cabin and found snow inside. Part of the roof had failed. He climbed up and forced boards into place with wedges, temporary, barely enough, but it reduced wind intrusion and bought them a night. He found a young family whose door had blown open and latch failed. He helped clear snow, revived the fire, rig a new latch with rope and wood. The young father watched him with gratitude and shame. Smian said nothing harsh, only explained how to use the fix. At another cabin, a support beam had cracked in the roof, sagged dangerously. The family was afraid to move. Semyon wedged himself into the cramped roof space and used his body and a spare beam as temporary support, instructing the father below how to brace and distribute weight. Muscles screamed. Cold seeped into him, but the roof held. He moved from crisis to crisis. Each patch was rough, a stopgap just enough to last until dawn. His hands lost feeling, returned in burning pain, then went numb again. Oil ran low. He found more. Time stopped being meaningful. There was only the next cabin, the next emergency, the next thin margin between life and death. At some point the wind began to weaken, not to calm, but to something merely severe. Visibility improved enough to show black outlines of cabins against a lighter sky. Exhausted beyond anything he had known, Semyon kept going, looking, checking, making sure no one was missed. When the first gray light finally bled into the east, he turned home. His son opened the latch from inside. Warmth hurt his frozen skin. Children helped peel off stiff outer layers. Ekaterina watched him with relief and fear, seeing how close he had come to not returning. No words were enough. Later, the settlement's gratitude spread as patches had held. Without him, some families might have frozen to death. Others might have lost everything. Stories began to grow, as stories always do, some claiming he saved dozens, some turning the wind itself into a supernatural enemy he battled. But those who were there remembered a simpler truth. Eamon acted methodically in impossible conditions because someone had to. In the following weeks, Ekaterina slowly recovered. The settlement rebuilt with hard minus earned lessons: steeper roofs, stronger latches, better bracing, improved ceiling. Knowledge increased, and survival odds rose with it. What had once seemed like Semyon's peculiar obsession became common practice. Years passed. His son became skilled, sometimes understanding mechanics faster than his father, and together they refined techniques neither could have developed alone. Semyon began making rough written notes, sketches, and reminders: what angles worked, what materials lasted, where failures began. How formal plans filled wisdom meant to keep people alive. And beyond the personal story, stories remained for later scholars: grooved interior logs whose purpose is debated, curved chimneys in places where such skill seems unlikely, narrow trenches around cabins that might be wind management, drainage, pests, fencing lines, far ritual boundaries, caches of objects beneath thresholds, coins, beads, nails, bones, Tekkon's evidence of protection practiced in both practical and spiritual forms. In the end, the wind outlasted them all. Cabins rotted, roofs collapsed. People returned to Earth. What remained were fragments, patterns, traces, questions without final answers. Perhaps that is fitting. Some knowledge was meant to serve its moment, then fade, leaving only the faint echo of human ingenuity quiet, uncelebrated, and stubbornly alive. And if tonight you hear wind press against your own window, safe behind insulated walls and reliable heat, remember what those older walls once faced. Remember that warmth is not a given. It is something humanity learned to build, maintain, and pass on one winter, one repair, one generation at a time. If you want, I can also produce a more official boring history minus style English script versions in plot. More hook minus driven pacing, voice minus over-friendly while keeping the historical caution and not inventing false certainty. Walls of the elite were constructed with advantages that most frontier families could barely imagine. For a settler's cabin used whatever timber could be cut and hauled by a single family's labor. Elite residences employed hired craftsmen who could select the finest logs from the best forests. These craftsmen knew techniques learned in established cities, brought with them standards of construction that reflected generations of refined practice. The walls of elite homes were often double-layered with logs, both inside and out, and an air gap between them filled with insulating material. This double construction required far more timber and far more labor, but it created a barrier against wind and cold that was significantly more effective than any single wall cabin could achieve. The gaps between logs were CHK, ready not just with moss and clay, but with carefully prepared mixtures that might include lime, hair, and other binding agents that created more durable seals. The windows of elite homes were fitted with actual glass imported at considerable expense from distant manufacturers. Glass was a luxury that transformed the experience of winter indoors. It allowed light to enter while keeping wind completely out, something that high-covered openings could never fully achieve. Heavy wooden shutters could be closed over the glass when storms were most severe, providing additional protection. These shutters were mounted on iron hinges that did not warp or break like the leather hinges common in settler cabins. The doors were constructed of thick planks, often reinforced with iron straps, and fitted into frames built with precision that minimized gaps. The chimneys of elite homes were another mark of privilege. While settlers struggled with chimneys built from field stone and clay, often crude and prone to cracking, elite homes featured chimneys constructed of brick. Brick was expensive. It had to be made, which required clay deposits, fuel for firing, and skilled labor imported, which added transportation costs. But brick chimneys were for superior in performance. They drew more consistently. They withstood heat without cracking, and they could be designed with internal baffles and curves that managed smoke and prevented downdrafts more effectively than stone chimneys ever could. The hearths in elite homes were larger, capable of holding bigger fires that produced more heat. The floors of elite residences were often PLKED, wood rather than packed earth, creating another barrier against cold rising from the ground. Some particularly wealthy homes had raised wooden floors with a crawl space beneath, providing an additional layer of insulation. Walls might be covered with fabric or decorated with painted panels, both of which added modest insulating value, but more importantly transformed the psychological experience of the space. A decorated interior felt warmer somehow, more civilized, farther removed from the rock-old outside. The wealthy could afford to burn more fuel. Their storehouses held larger reserves of firewood, sometimes supplemented with coal, imported at great expense, while settler families carefully rationed each log, counting what remained and worrying whether supplies would last until spring. Elite households could keep fires burning higher and longer. The difference in temperature might only be a few degrees, but those degrees matter immensely for comfort and health. Children in wealthy homes were less likely to suffer from constant cold exposure. Adults could work at desks or tables without their hands going numb. Sleep was less interrupted by shivering and the need to tend fires. The positioning of elite homes also reflected privilege. Wealthy residents could choose the most favorable building sites, locations where natural features of the landscape provided windbreaks, a hillside that blocked north winds, stand of mature forest that disrupted the wind's path, a slight valley that offered protection. These desirable locations, went to those with power and resources. Settlers took what remained. Theft and exposed locations where wind struck with full force. The wealthy built their homes in clusters that might be called neighborhoods, structures positioned close enough together that they provided mutual wind protection. The spaces between elite homes were often enclosed with high fences or walls, creating courtyards that were sheltered from wind. These courtyards became social spaces during winter months, places where children could play and adults could move between buildings without facing the full blast of open-air wind. Settler cabins scattered more widely across the landscape lacked these communal windbreaks. Inside elite homes, winter evenings unfolded differently than in settler cabins, with better light from multiple candles or oil lamps, another expense most settlers could not afford. Wealthy families could engage in activities that required good illumination. Reading was possible not just by the fitful light of the hearth, but by steady lamplight. Writing letters, keeping account books, studying maps. These were evening occupations of the educated and prosperous. Music was sometimes played. Instruments that would be damaged by the temperature extremes in poorly heated cabins could survive in well-maintained elite homes. The wind outside was still audible, still present, but it became more like theatrical backdrop than immediate threat. Wealthy families gathered in the evening, not huddled around the hearth for survival, but seated in chairs around tables. Their comfort assured, conversations could be held at normal volume rather than shouted over the wind's roar. The constant sensory assault of cold drafts, smoke, and the creaking of stressed timbers was greatly reduced. Winter for the elite retained an element of inconvenience and confinement, but it lacked the existential dread that characterized the settler experience. When storms arrived, wealthy families prepared differently. Their servants for elite households often employed servants would be dispatched to ensure that shutters were secured, that additional firewood was brought inside, that the kitchen was stocked with provisions. The family itself might need to do little more than retreat to the most sheltered rooms and wait for the storm to pass. If damage occurred, craftsmen could be hired for repairs. If supplies ran low, wealth could purchase what was available, often at inflated prices that desperate sellers could charge when winter isolated communities from normal trade routes. Wealth did not make one immune to winter, but it provided buffers that transformed the experience. Yet privilege on the frontier was relative, and even the wealthy faced limitations and fears that would be unfamiliar to their counterparts in established cities. Glass windows, while far superior to hide coverings, could still shatter in extreme conditions. Ice storms, freezing rain that coated everything in thick layers of ice, could break even the best windows, leaving elite homes suddenly exposed to wind and cold. When this happened, the damage was not just to property, but to the psychological comfort of security. A broken window in the middle of winter with replacement glass hundreds of kilometers away was a serious crisis. Temporary repairs using boards or hide were humiliating for those who prided themselves on their superior accommodations. Brick chimneys, though more reliable than stone, could still fail. They stood firm inside the flue during extreme cold, blocking the passage and causing smoke to back up into the house. The weight of accumulated snow on roofs could exceed the capacity even of well-built structures, causing beams to crack and sections to collapse. When elite homes suffered catastrophic failures, the shock was perhaps greater than for settlers who lived with constant precariances. The wealthy expected their privilege to protect them, and when it did not, the failure felt particularly unjust. Supply chains that the elite depended upon were vulnerable to weather in ways that highlighted the fragility of their advantages. A wealthy family might plan to host a formal dinner, expecting imported delicacies, fine tea, preserved fruit, quality spirits, only to find that the caravan bringing such goods had been delayed or destroyed by storms. Suddenly, their abundance looked much like everyone else's scarcity. The servants they employed to manage their households might be unable to reach work during the worst weather, forcing elite family members to perform tasks they considered beneath their station. Hulling firewood, tending stoves, even basic cleaning. These moments revealed how much of their comfort depended on others' labor and how quickly that comfort could evaporate when circumstances changed. Social hierarchies persisted through winter, but were sometimes complicated by the demands of survival. When a major storm threatened an entire settlement, wealthy residents might open their superior homes to neighbors whose cabins were failing. This was partly charity, but also pragmatism. A settlement where many people died weakened everyone, reducing available labor, trade, and community resilience. An elite family hosting a settler family in their guest room during a 3-day blizzard experienced a strange intimacy. Social boundaries blurred when people shared confined space and genuine danger. These temporary equalization as often ended as soon as the crisis passed, with hierarchies reasserting themselves. But they left traces in the community's memory. People remembered who had offered shelter and who had not. The maintenance of elite homes required constant attention, though this attention was often performed by paid labor rather than the homeowner's hands. Servants monitored gaps in sinking, cleared snow from roofs, kept multiple fires burning in different rooms. But the fundamental battle was the same as for settlers. Wind constantly sought entry, cold constantly tried to steal warmth. Structures constantly needed repair. The elite simply had more resources to throw at the problem, which changed the experience, but not the underlying reality. A governor living in the finest house in a frontier town still woke some mornings to frost on the inside of his windows, still heard wind howling around his walls, still felt drafts that his expensive construction could not entirely eliminate. Wealth bought degrees of comfort, not absolute immunity. The social calendar of elite communities was profoundly shaped by winter's constraints. In warmer months, there might be outdoor gatherings, hunting parties, excursions to scenic locations. Winter contracted social life dramatically. The elite visited each other's homes when possible, turning these visits into elaborate social rituals that helped pass the long, dark months. That such visits required either very short distances, neighbors close enough to reach without serious exposure, or careful planning and favorable weather. A dinner invitation might be extended weeks in advance with the understanding that actual attendance depended on whether the wind died down and snow conditions allowed travel. Cancelled plans were common, and the disappointment of isolation affected the wealthy as much as anyone. Humans are social creatures, and even those with comfortable homes and adequate supplies suffered from the loneliness of being cut off from their peers for weeks at a time. The psychological strain of confinement, seeing only one's immediate family and household servants, unable to escape into wider social networks, created tensions that sometimes erupted into conflict. Families that got along well enough when they could retreat to separate pursuits found themselves on edge when forced into constant proximity. Marital disputes, conflicts between parents and children, tensions with servants. All of these were exacerbated by the inability to find space and distance. Elite families were not immune to the cabin fever that affected everyone trapped indoors by winter winds. The children of elite families had different winter experiences than settler children, yet still faced limitations and fears. They had warmer clothes, better nutrition, safer homes. They were less likely to suffer from frostbite or malnutrition or the constant low-grade cold that weakened settler children's health. But they still knew fear when storms rose, still heard the wind's menacing voice, still understood on some level that outside was deadly. Elite children were often educated indoors during winter months by tutors or literate family members, and the quality of this education depended heavily on keeping the study space warm enough that ink did not freeze, and fingers remained nimble enough to hold pens. Even privilege could not fully escape winter's constraints. Sometimes the contrast between elite and settler experiences was most visible in the aftermath of major storms. When dawn came after a catastrophic night of wind, elite families might emerge from homes that were damaged but intact, facing repairs that were significant but manageable. Settler families might emerge to find their homes destroyed, their survival dependent on community charity, and their ability to rebuild from almost nothing. The differential impact of the same storm highlighted inequality in stark terms. The wealthy understood, at least dimly, that their privilege was somewhat fragile on the frontier. In established cities far from the frontier, class distinctions were more rigid, hierarchies more stable. On the frontier, fortune could shift more rapidly. A wealthy merchant could lose everything if a trading venture failed. A governor could be recalled or replaced, losing position and privilege. The wilderness pressed in on everyone, and, while wealth provided cushioning, it did not guarantee permanent security. This awareness sometimes created a degree of humility, a recognition that being wealthy on the frontier was different from being wealthy in safe established places. Some elite residents developed genuine respect for the hardness of settlers who survived with so much less. Others remained dismissive or oblivious, insulated by their advantages from understanding what life was truly like for those with fewer resources. Human nature varied then as now. One interesting aspect of elite winter life was the way some wealthy individuals became patrons of knowledge about winter survival. A prosperous merchant might fund the construction of a communal storm shelter, not just from altruism, but because a surviving community was good for business. A governor might order the compilation of best practices for winter building, distributing this information to new settlers as a way of reducing winter mortality rates. Elite residents with time and education sometimes documented frontier knowledge that would otherwise remain purely oral. These documents, journals, letters, official reports now provide historians with valuable insight into frontier life, though they come filtered through the perspective of privilege. An elite observer writing about how settlers weathered winter might miss or misunderstand aspects that a settler would consider obvious while noticing things that settlers took for granted. The architectural legacy of elite construction on the frontier outlasted most settler cabins, built with better materials and maintained by more resources. Elite homes had higher survival rates through the centuries. When archaeologists excavate frontier settlements, the most intact structures are usually those built for the wealthy. This creates a skewed archaeological record. We have better physical evidence of how the elite lived than how common settlers lived. The irony is that the elite, being a small minority, represent the unusual rather than the typical frontier experience. Their homes tell us about the possibilities of frontier building when resources were abundant. But most people lived without such resources. Constructing the more common experience requires looking at fragmentary area remains of simpler structures and reading between the lines of elite documents that mention the poor primarily as objects of concern or labor. There were also interesting cases of fallen elite families who arrived with wealth, but lost it due to bad fortune, poor decisions, or catastrophic losses. These families sometimes ended up living in conditions closer to common settlers, a descent that was psychologically devastating. Family that had lived with glazed windows and brick chimneys, now making do with hide coverings and stone hearths, experienced winter not just with physical discomfort, but with the bitter taste of lost status. Their children, who remembered warmer houses, had to adapt to harsher conditions. Such families sometimes became bridges between social classes, possessing elite knowledge and perspectives, but living settler realities. Their adaptation strategies, seeing how they coped with reduced circumstances, what skills they developed, what knowledge they retained or discarded, far insights into the relationship between material resources and survival competence. As we consider these contrasts between elite and common experiences, a larger truth emerges about winter winds on the frontier. The wind itself was indifferent to human hierarchies. It blew with equal force against mansions and cabins, seeking entry wherever structure met space. What differed was human capacity to resist. Thicker walls, better materials, more labor, superior knowledge. Privilege bought resistance but not immunity. The most secure elite home was still a fragile bubble of warmth in a vast cold landscape. The least secure settler cabin still represented human ingenuity and determination. Between these extremes lay a spectrum of experiences, all shaped by the same fundamental challenge of surviving winter winds. There is something almost philosophical in contemplating this range of experiences, how the same environmental force pressed upon different lives with similar realities, but met different barriers created different outcomes. A wealthy child sleeping warm under imported blankets in a well-heated room, and a settler child huddled under pieced-together furs in a drafty cabin were, of living through the same winter under the same sky surrounded by the same howling wind. Their experiences were profoundly different in comfort and security, yet fundamentally similar in being human responses to deadly cold. Both families worried when the wind rose to a shriek. Both felt relief when storms passed without catastrophic damage. Both knew the deep satisfaction of making it through another winter. Seeing the first signs of spring thaw, the elite had easier winters, but they were still winter. Thaw was different in degree, but not entirely in kind. A wealthy family losing their home to storm was rare but possible, and the knowledge that disaster could strike, however buffered by resources, created its own form of anxiety. Settlers lived with constant precariances, that they also lived with a kind of fatalistic acceptance, a knowledge that they had done what they could, and that survival often came down to luck as much as preparation. As dawn approaches and our journey through these memories of winter winds begins to draw toward its close, let us hold in our minds this complex picture of frontier winter life. Not a single story. The many stories lived at different levels of comfort and security, but all pressed upon by the same cold winds. The architecture of privilege and the architecture of necessity existed side by side, sometimes learning from each other, always defined by their relationship to the environment they inhabited. The wind blew through it all, democratic in its pressure, even if human responses were ratified by wealth and power. And when spring finally came, as it always eventually did, the elite and settler emerged from their respective shelters into a world transformed by warmth, grateful to have survived another season of deadly winds. The stratification of comfort would persist through other seasons. That winter's end was celebrated across all social boundaries, a shared relief that made the human community briefly more visible than the hierarchies within it. The wind's voice faded to breezes, and life continued, as it had, and would for as long as people chose to make their homes in that cold land. And so we arrive at the end of our slow journey through the frozen world of early frontier settlements, where winter winds shaped every aspect of existence. We have walked through the daily struggles of common settlers, followed the life of one man who learned to read the wind, explored the mysteries embedded in old construction techniques, and witnessed how privilege altered, but did not eliminate the challenge of surviving winter. What remains when we look back across all these fragments of history is a picture of human persistence, of the countless small adaptations that allowed life to continue in conditions that seem almost unimaginable to us now. The people who lived through those winters, whether in rough cabins or relatively comfortable elite homes, endured something we are largely spared. We who live in climate-controlled homes behind insulated walls and double-paned windows with central heating that responds to a thermostat's touch have been freed from the constant battle against cold and wind that defined frontier winter life. Our ancestors fought that battle so persistently that we inherited a world where such struggles became increasingly rare. When we feel a draft in our modern homes, we consider it an annoyance worth fixing, not an accepted feature of daily life. When the heating falters, we call professionals to repair it, that spend desperate hours trying to coax warmth from inadequate fires. The transformation across a few generations has been profound. Sleep through winter nights without waking to tend fires or check for roof damage. Children grow up never knowing the constant cold that their distant ancestors accepted as normal. This is not to say we face no challenges. Every era has its own difficulties. That the specific challenge of keeping deadly wind at bay has been largely solved for most of us. Yet there is value in remembering what was endured. Those frontier settlers packing moss between logs with frozen fingers, rebuilding after storms, sharing knowledge that helped families survive. They were not special or heroic in their own minds. They were simply doing what had to be done to continue living. Their ordinariness is part of what makes their efforts remarkable. They did not expect monuments or recognition. They expected to wake each morning, assess the damage from the night, make repairs, and continue. The rhythm of their days was defined by necessity. They met that necessity with practical determination. Seems Ewan A. Gregory, the wind reader whose story we followed, represents something important about human adaptation. He was shaped by childhood trauma, the loss of his family's home, into someone who made it his life's work to understand and resist the forces that had caused that loss. His knowledge was hard-won, built from careful observation over decades. His legacy was not fame or wealth, but the continued survival of people who benefited from his insights. This kind of quiet competence, expertise developed through patient attention and shared, without expectation of reward, is perhaps one of the most valuable human qualities. It appears throughout history in countless forms. Most of it undocumented, most of the practitioners unknown to us. But the effects persist. Knowledge passed down, techniques refined, communities made more resilient, the mysteries we explored, the grooved logs, the carved chimneys, the unexplained trenches, remind us that much of human experience escapes documentation. People solved problems in ways that made sense to them in their context with their available resources and cultural frameworks. When enough time passes and contexts change, those solutions can become puzzling to later observers. We do our best to interpret the fragments that remain, but honest interpretation acknowledges its own limitations. The past is not a book we can simply read. It is a damaged text with missing pages written in languages we only partly understand, describing experiences foreign to our own. We reconstruct what we can, dinner what we cannot fully know, and remain humble about the limits of our understanding. The contrast between elite and settler experiences highlights how resource inequality shapes lived reality. Both groups faced winter winds, with vastly different means of resistance. This pattern, the privileged being able to buy greater comfort and security, is not unique to frontier Siberia or to winter survival. It appears across human societies in countless forms. What makes the frontier case particularly stark is how directly the inequality translated into physical comfort and survival chances. There was little room for abstraction or rationalization. Thicker walls meant more warmth. Full stop. Better supplies meant less hunger directly and obviously. The naked clarity of these relationships perhaps made inequality harder to ignore, though human capacity for accepting or justifying social hierarchies should never be underestimated. As we sit here in the deep quiet of night, or the early stillness of morning, or wherever this story finds you in your own daily rhythm, we can reflect on what we have inherited from those who struggled against winter winds. He inherited structures, not just physical buildings, though some frontier architecture persists in museums and historical sites, but knowledge structures, problem-minus solving approaches, traditions of mutual aid and community resilience that were forged in harsh conditions. We inherited a certain toughness, perhaps a genetic and cultural legacy of people who survived when survival was genuinely difficult. We inherited technologies and techniques that evolved from simpler origins. Modern insulation has its distant ancestors in moss packing, modern weather stripping and hide strips wedged around doors. We inherited stories, though many have been lost or transformed in the telling. Stories that remind us what humans can endure and overcome. But perhaps most importantly, we inherited a world where fewer people must endure what those frontier settlers endured. Each generation that improved building techniques, that developed better materials, that shared knowledge more widely, that created systems of support and safety. Each generation reduced the number of people who faced deadly winter winds from fragile shelters. This is a form of progress worth acknowledging, even as we recognize that progress is uneven and that many people worldwide still face conditions of precarious that the settlers would recognize. History is not a simple story of improvement, but neither is it meaningless suffering. The struggles mattered because they lead to changes, to learned lessons, the increments of betterment that accumulated over time. As you prepare to drift towards sleep, or as you move into your day, carry with you perhaps this thought: The walls around you, whatever they are made of, stand between you and forces that were once immediate and deadly. Someone figured out how to build those walls, or walls like them. Someone passed that knowledge forward. Someone labored to construct them. The shelter you inhabit is the heir to countless earlier shelters, each one teaching lessons that inform the next. The warmth you feel is warmth that earlier generations struggled to create and maintain. You are the beneficiary of accumulated human ingenuity applied to the basic problem of staying warm and alive. This is not meant to induce guilt for your comfort. You did not choose to be born into this time, rather than that one. But perhaps it can inspire quiet gratitude, an acknowledgement that comfort is not natural or guaranteed, but rather built, maintained, and passed forward through human effort. When the wind rises outside your window tonight, and you hear it pressing against the glass, you might think for a moment about settlers who heard similar wind, faced it with so much less, and then you might sink deeper into your blankets, grateful for the technology and knowledge and accumulated wisdom that stands between you and the cold. Let yourself drift now into whatever rest awaits you. The wind blows still somewhere over landscapes where people once struggled against it with moss and clay and determination. But here now you are safe. The walls are strong. The heat is reliable. The night is merely peaceful darkness rather than threatening cold. The stories we have traced tonight of daily hardship, of one man's life shaped by wind, of mysteries embedded in old structures, of privilege and poverty both pressed by the same cold forces. These stories have done their work. They have filled the quiet hours with gentle fascination, with history's slow rhythms, with the calm contemplation of lives lived long ago. As you close your eyes, let those frozen landscapes fade into softer visions, dreams less troubled than the reality those settlers knew. You have traveled with me through winter's harsh grip on the early frontier, and now you can return to your own comfort, your own warmth, your own safe shelter. The wind that once threatened survival now becomes merely a sound, distant and neutralized, perhaps even soothing in its remoteness. Sleep well, knowing that the long battle against winter winds has been largely won, that you are heir to that victory, that the warmth around you represents humanity's patient triumph over one of nature's oldest challenges. The deadly winds still blow across Siberian plains, across any cold landscape, but they blow past structures built with the knowledge those early settlers helped develop. They blow themselves out against walls that remember in their design, if not their materials, the lessons learned log by log, storm by storm, generation by generation. And here, in this moment, you need only rest, comfortable and warm, while history's hard-won wisdom keeps you safe through the quiet hours. Good night, travelers through time. Good rest to you, wherever you are, whatever hour you find yourself in. May your sleep be deep and your dreams be gentle, free from the howling winds that once threatened, but now only whisper in memory, growing fainter as you drift away into peaceful darkness, into warm and restful sleep, into the quiet that follows all stories when they finally softly come to their end.